Okay, so here's a little description of kinetic versus static friction. So we have learned that the frictional force can be calculated using this formula. So this means that the frictional force is going to be equal to the normal force, which for a flat surface is the weight, but it's basically the force that pushes the two surfaces together. I think I'll draw a surface and a something. Looks like a box, and the box is being pulled, and there would be friction between the floor and the box, and friction would pull back, slowing it down or retarding the force, making it less. The normal force is the force between these two surfaces, so it's the force of the ground pushing up on the box, which is the same as the force as the box pushing down on the ground. And then this mu variable is the coefficient of friction. Now, that coefficient of friction technically is either going to be kinetic friction or static friction. So, definition-wise, kinetic friction means the two surfaces are moving relative to one another, whereas static friction means the two forces are not moving. They are static or stationary, not moving relative to one another. So that's all fine and dandy, but the interesting thing, and the thing that we will actually do some calculating with, is that the coefficient of static friction tends to be more. So in the two surfaces, we can kind of explain it like this. Here's the microscopic view, again, of two surfaces. So here's the box. And here's the floor, let's say. Okay. So when the two surfaces are not moving relative to one another, they tend to get squished together. Okay, and settle into one another. Whereas when they're moving relative to one another, this is moving this way, this is moving this way, they don't really have time to settle in and get close. So that's actually kind of a decent explanation of why, conceptually, the coefficient of static friction is more than kinetic friction. Let's look at a couple examples. So here are two examples we need to talk about concerning the difference between kinetic and static coefficient of friction. So in the top example we have a race car. Obviously this person's pretty excited. They're accelerating greatly, and you picture the tires peeling out. Okay. So what I've watched these drag racers do this, and what happens is they sort of peel out the back tires to heat them up, and then while they're accelerating, what they try to do is not have their back tires slip. Okay? Because if the tire stays in contact with the road and simply rolls, it's actually going to get greater traction. Okay? So that burning out, the with all the smoke that you'll see at the beginning, is simply to heat up the tires, and that actually increases the coefficient of friction. I knew this guy who would take his climbing shoes. He was trying this really difficult, slippery section, and he would pour, don't do this at home, he would pour white gas on the soles and then light it on fire. I don't think he was wearing them at the time that he did this, but he would light them on fire so the soles of his shoes would actually burn for a second or two. He didn't put a lot of white gas on them, but that heated them up, and then he'd quickly slip the shoes on and try this difficult climb, hoping that his shoes would stick. The second example is the car. So this is you, and you're driving down the street, and it has snowed, so here's all this ice on the road, and then here is the poor unhappy bear, just looking for some food, not wanting to get hit. So you slam on your brakes and continue sliding towards the poor unhappy bear. Hopefully you have anti-lock brakes, and so in your brake pedal, it'll probably jiggle a little bit, okay, and that means that the anti-lock brakes have been activated. And what it does is, if your tires lock up, okay, all of a sudden they're not moving and the road is passing by here, so the surface of the tire and the road are moving relative to one another. This is moving this way, the road's moving this way, instead of rolling along the road. So the friction you get is actually less from your tires if they are sliding. So what the anti-lock brake mechanism does is lets off the brakes for a microsecond so that they start rolling again. Because once, excuse me, these are your tires. Once the tires start rolling, they are all of a sudden in contact with the road and they will get better friction. As well as the fact that you can steer to avoid the bear if your front tires are rolling along the ground instead of sliding. So lastly, we have this situation. We will be doing a lab where we're measuring and calculating mu. So mu sub k and mu sub s. So the coefficient of static friction and the coefficient of kinetic friction. So we have a block, and the block is going to slide down an inclined plane. So I'm hoping it makes sense that if you start with the inclined plane like this and the box like this, nothing's going to happen. But as you lift this up with this on the ground, okay, at some angle, the block will just start to slide, okay. So the block was not moving relative to the plane, and you got it to a certain angle, and all of a sudden the block is moving relative to the plane. From this angle right here, you will be able to calculate the coefficient of static friction, okay? And I'm going to help you draw out a vector diagram to calculate that. If you tilt it a little farther up, so let's say like this, and you just sort of let it go, it's going to accelerate. From the acceleration, so given the angle, given the acceleration, you will be able to determine the coefficient of kinetic friction. So I think that I'll create a different lesson with more detail concerning a vector diagram and how those calculations would actually take place. Or maybe I'll just let you figure them out on your own.